For most people in the world, Elizabeth II has always been the Queen of England. Her coronation pictured in fading film, like a piece of ancient history.
The Archbishop lifts the crown of St. Edward and holds it for a moment above the Queen's head. As he gently lowers it, a great shout is raised from the congregation.
The past is sometimes called another country, and Elizabeth's coronation does not only belong to another time, but it happened in another place. It's a well-worn but true fact that the pace of change in the world has sped up, and with every day, the world of Elizabeth's coronation accelerates further away into the past, out of history and into myth. It is hard to remember a time when Elizabeth was not queen, hard to realize she too was once young. To understand Elizabeth is to realize the woman who would be queen in the 21st century was educated and raised not even in the 20th century, but the Britain of her great-great-grandmother, Victoria. Though born in 1926, Elizabeth's upbringing was already old-fashioned. She and her sister Margaret have been described as the last real 19th century princesses. She was taught royalty should never show emotion, good or bad, never smile or cry in public. She was raised from her earliest years to her job in the world to understand that duty comes first. Elizabeth came to the throne in 1952, aged just 25. For much of the world, Elizabeth has always been older. It's forgotten that the accession of a young woman to the throne electrified the world. People looked back in history. No one had come to the throne so young since Victoria, a queen who had seen one of Britain's longest reigns and most glorious periods of history. And they looked to the first Queen Elizabeth, again a woman who had come to the throne young and who had ushered Britain's rise to world power status. Elizabeth II has been named for her mother, not in any attempt to recall the terrifyingly majestic Tudor queen of the 16th century. Winston Churchill, as Prime Minister, began romantic, fanciful talk of a new Elizabethan age, when the grimness of the war years would fade away and a new Britain with a new greatness would arise. The coronation was sold to the British people as a mix of the old and the new. There was the medieval splendor of the ceremony with gold and fur and trumpets and mysterious language. There was the traditional glory of the British Empire. It was a show of strength with troops from all over the empire and the lesser kings and rulers of countries from the entire extended family of the British civilization. When Elizabeth came to the throne, many British still clung to the idea of the empire. With Churchill as Prime Minister, it was unlikely even an inch of land would change colour. India may have gone, but Britain still saw its remaining empire as something in which to take pride. The colonies were the younger children of the British family, children who still had to grow up, and for whom Britain had a responsibility, a duty to look after and bring to adulthood, to somehow turn into versions of Australia or Canada. In the early years of Elizabeth's reign, this old-fashioned idea had been spun. Now, new technologies were to develop the empire. Men in white coats building dams and power plants replaced the Victorian soldiers in red coats building forts. In reality, already trouble was gathering in the empire. Elizabeth had actually become queen while on a visit to Kenya, and when in Africa, Elizabeth had been surrounded by tight security against attack by African Mau Mau guerrillas fighting for Kenyan independence. It is hard for the modern world to realize that when Elizabeth began her reign, royalty was given complete deference and respect. Any politician who breathed even the slightest criticism of the monarchy was condemned to the lunatic fringe, their career in ruins. The media practiced a rigid self-censorship that would protect even long-dead members of the royal family. The coronation was a landmark in British history. 16 months passed between Elizabeth coming to the throne and her being crowned. In that time, a frenzy of excitement grew. At last, old wartime controls were being relaxed. The British people were beginning to ride the wave of 1950s prosperity. The newspapers and the new medium of television devoured every detail of Elizabeth. It was intrusive, demanding, and hungry coverage that wanted more and more, and could not help but challenge the old deference. The monarch was being turned into a celebrity, to be gossiped about, into a sort of public property. The tradition of the crown and the empire was to become mixed with the new ways of seeing the British sovereign. Both could not survive. Something would have to give. Perhaps it is the memory of recent events and the later half of Elizabeth's reign, but the fact is that from the very start, Elizabeth has had to face challenge after challenge, crisis after crisis, always with a tension between the modern world and the old, the reformer and the conservative. The truth is that Elizabeth's instincts have always gone with the cautious, always with the old. She responds by doing what she's been taught is her duty, and she believes that duty involves sacrifice. There was tension straight away over just what her people were allowed to see of the coronation. There had been a Christmas between her coming to the throne and her coronation. Elizabeth had refused to have her Christmas broadcast televised, and she did not want the coronation seen. The crowning of a British sovereign is a piece of mysticism. Were it part of someone else's culture, we would talk about magic, a kind of British voodoo. The Queen is anointed, prays to God, invoking His help. She takes Holy Communion, coming into the physical presence of Christ. To a practicing Christian, no mere ritual. As throughout her reign, it would be popular opinion that demanded change, to which Elizabeth reluctantly gave way. Elizabeth II really believes in who she is and her duty. Those old images of the coronation seem to belong to theme park Britain, part of the costume drama of shows put on for foreign tourists. That is not the way Elizabeth sees it. She really believes in the coronation as the consecration of a human being to become someone special, as an act of human sacrifice to the nation. Almost immediately, Elizabeth became queen. She became embroiled in a scandal. A crisis that was at one and the same time intensely personal and very public. Elizabeth's younger sister Margaret was described by everyone who knew them both as the opposite of Elizabeth. Elizabeth, dutiful and sensible. Margaret was the funny, naughty little girl, the cheeky child. Elizabeth, who gets up early to enjoy the open air. Margaret, who would come back a few hours later from a nightclub. Elizabeth, who enjoys horses and the Scottish Highlands. Margaret, who enjoyed the company of artists, actors, and musicians. Yet despite the differences between them, the two women were described as intensely close, with a near telepathic knowledge, if not always understanding, of each other's moods, needs, and feelings. Each were aware that only the other was like herself. They were unique. But it was not an even relationship. Elizabeth saw her sister as a responsibility to be looked after, organized, and protected. It seems a childhood relationship grew up with the girls. Elizabeth's younger sister had grown up into a glamorous woman, classed among the semi-official list of the most beautiful in the world. She was placed alongside film stars. The whole world seemed breathlessly hungry for information on anything and everything that Margaret did, where she did it, and with whom she did it. Margaret seemed to have natural charisma, beauty and style, with which her sister simply could not compete. Elizabeth simply pretended cameras were not there. Margaret, though, loved to flirt and tease the lens. In 1952, before the coronation, Margaret had told her older sister that she had fallen in love with a man and wanted to be married. By definition, the royal family is no ordinary family. By law, until she was 25, Margaret had to have her sister's permission to marry. It was a law designed to prevent heirs to the throne making the wrong sort of marriage. Margaret was, of course, already a remote heir to the throne. Elizabeth's 2 children stood in front of her. There was little chance of there ever being a Queen Margaret. It catapulted Elizabeth into a major crisis straight away, and the way Elizabeth dealt with the problem was to set a pattern for her reign. Margaret's choice was trouble. The man Elizabeth's younger sister wanted to marry was 18 years older, not royal, a commoner, and divorced. He was RAF officer Group Captain Peter Townsend, a royal equerry, one of the group of officials running the royal household. Townsend can be seen in the background of many a royal event in the 1940s, opening car doors, checking this, organizing that. It was on such a royal tour to South Africa in 1947 that Townsend and Margaret became close. He had become very close to the whole family. Elizabeth's father, the king, had come to see Townsend almost as a son. Most families might worry about a 22-year-old wanting to marry a divorced man old enough to be her father. But the rules, the book by which Elizabeth did her job, made this no ordinary family problem. Both Elizabeth and Margaret had only simple schooling, but Elizabeth had been given extra tuition in the British Constitution, in the theory and practice of being the British monarch. Elizabeth had been given the strictest teaching on her duty. This, coupled with her naturally serious personality, meant she would do the job of being queen by the book, to the exact letter. Elizabeth was, as queen, also the head of the Church of England. The Church of England believed divorced men and women, even innocent partners of the brutal or unfaithful, could not remarry. To do so would be adultery. It was a hardline fundamental belief based on the strictest reading of the Bible. In Britain as a whole, to be divorced was to be disapproved of. Not so long before this time, the divorced were not allowed to meet the sovereign. Obtaining a divorce was difficult. Often one partner had to pretend to commit adultery before the state would dissolve an unhappy marriage. Elizabeth knew that she must obey the rules of the church, of which she was head, and believed her sister should not marry Townsend. Margaret told Elizabeth of her love for Townsend in 1952. Elizabeth asked her sister to wait until after the coronation before going any further. This was to set the pattern for Elizabeth's life, to look the other way, to be an emotional ostrich, to pretend if she ignored a problem, it would somehow go away. Time and time again in the future, Elizabeth would just look the other way when faced by family difficulties or problems. The world knew nothing of the crisis facing the new queen until the coronation. Margaret was famously seen to simply brush away a fleck of thread or dust from Townsend's uniform in a single gesture that gave away the secret. What became known as the Townsend Affair is a landmark in the story of how Britain has changed in Elizabeth's reign. The story broke into the press and pandemonium broke out. For the first time ever, the British press felt it all right to comment, to openly discuss and even pry into the life of the royal family, to have opinion polls on what the royal family should do. Elizabeth was guided by a circle of powerful courtiers and officials in the royal household. Townsend they thought bad, Margaret they believed mad. Elizabeth's sister would later say that if at the very beginning someone told her the truth, that it was impossible to marry her lover, then the affair would have ended. Instead, Elizabeth and the court allowed the affair to drag on. Repeatedly, Margaret was told to wait, Elizabeth hoping it was a phase her sister might grow out of. The couple was separated. Townsend was to be sent away. He was appointed as an heir attaché to the British Embassy in Belgium. Margaret was sent off on a tour of Rhodesia, modern-day Zimbabwe, with her mother. Margaret was told Townsend's departure for Brussels would be delayed, that he would be in London to say goodbye to her when she returned. The royal household had lied to her. Margaret was told in the middle of the African tour that Townsend was already gone. Newsreels of the day show Margaret disappearing from view with an official excuse of illness. The truth was that she was in a furious and disconsolate rage. At the time, and indeed to this day, many people in Britain thought Elizabeth's sister should have been allowed to marry whomever she liked. Time and time again are heard the words, they should have let her marry Peter Townsend. Elizabeth II was compared to the imperiously strong Tudor queen. Elizabeth I had famously said, "Can't is not a word for princes," that she would decide what she did, that she made the rules. But Elizabeth II would always do what the rules told her she should. Had Elizabeth II decided her sister could marry whom she wished, then it would have happened. The world began to realize Britain's queen was no modernizer or reformer. Elizabeth and the royal household strung Margaret along. Margaret and Townsend came to believe that it was a trial. They were told to wait for Townsend's appointment to end. It was to test their love. Elizabeth and the royal establishment were hoping the trouble would go away. In 1955, Townsend returned to England and the controversy roared back into life. The lenses of the paparazzi followed Townsend and Margaret everywhere. The newspapers screamed about the princess's love. The love affair of Elizabeth's sister became caught up in a campaign by modernizers that attacked the church. Many marriages were failing in the 1950s. Like Townsend's, they were hasty wartime matches that failed in peace. Reformers believed divorce should be easier and free of shame. Margaret had turned 25. The decision was now no longer Elizabeth's, and for the British government, it fell into the lap of the then new Prime Minister Anthony Eden. The Prime Minister himself was divorced, and he went to Balmoral, second wife in tow, to discuss Margaret and Townsend with Elizabeth. The press raged at the hypocrisy of it all. as Eden and Elizabeth decided the marriage was impossible. In the type of storytelling which mixes certain historical fact with rumour and hearsay, Elizabeth's husband did the dirty work of the royal family. With Prince Philip thunderously telling Margaret, while the Queen sat silent, that the princess could marry Townsend, but be Mrs. Townsend, and nothing more, that she would lose the rank of princess, lose her royal income, her privilege, have to live abroad, marry in a civil ceremony, and nothing more. Margaret famously refused the option and separated from her lover. It is incredible to think, when Elizabeth today stands by any of Britain's prime ministers, that her first was no less a figure than Winston Churchill. Churchill had figured in a much earlier and much less public controversy involving Elizabeth and her husband, but which had remained a serious problem throughout the 1950s. Philip had given up much through his marriage to Elizabeth. Most importantly, his marriage had deprived him of his naval career. In 1949, he had been posted to Malta and had been given his first command of a destroyer. He loved the Royal Navy. Philip has a notorious reputation for blunt, outspoken honesty and not tolerating fools. Anyone who has spent any time with the Royal Navy know that men like Philip can be found in every ship in the fleet. Many who know him talk of a man who had the ability to have risen to the very top, to become First Sea Lord, head of the Royal Navy. It is a massive what-if of history, but given Philip's age and the pace of naval careers, he could have been First Sea Lord at the time of the Falklands War in 1982. Cheap histories like to question Elizabeth's real name. When born, her name was Elizabeth Windsor, not in a sense her true name, but an alias. Her father was born Albert von Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. The royal family's name was changed in World War I through anti-German sentiment. Philip Mountbatten is itself a false name. He was born Philipp Schleswig-Holstein Sonderburg-Glucksburg. When he and Elizabeth were married in 1947, it also was too German a name. Elizabeth's wedding had been traditional, to a traditional man, and it was expected that she would take her husband's name. Yet Elizabeth II does not reign as monarch of the House of Mountbatten. Elizabeth and Philip's marriage had in no small way been manoeuvred by Philip's uncle, Lord Louis Mountbatten. It was Louis Mountbatten who suggested Philip's new name. Many saw a plot by the older Mountbatten, a vain, intensely ambitious and egocentric man, to change the name of the royal family to his and take over the crown. Elizabeth's father had not been long dead when Mountbatten toasted a dinner with the words, "The House of Mountbatten now rules." A British monarch is supposed to accept the guidance of the Prime Minister, and, on Churchill's advice, a man who loathed Louis Mountbatten, Elizabeth announced her name, her family's name, and the royal house remained Windsor. It is a measure of Elizabeth that she dutifully and properly took the advice of the government. It is as if the Prime Minister had told her to deliberately slap Philip's face in public, and she had obeyed. Churchill is recorded as saying he neither liked nor trusted Philip, and just hoped he would not harm Britain. Philip was heard to rage that he had been reduced to an amoeba, and from that point rumours of a serious rift in the royal marriage began, rumours that were still hidden from the public. Elizabeth would continually try to make amends to Philip. In one attempt, she asked Parliament to alter the regency laws to make Philip regent, her temporary replacement should something happen to her while Prince Charles was still a child. It was a disastrous piece of timing by Elizabeth. It came at the height of the Townsend affair. Elizabeth's sister Margaret, in the normal run of affairs, should have been regent. The tabloid press, on the side of Margaret and romance, saw it as a calculated demotion and punishment of the popular Queen's sister. Why should a foreign-born man, in reality a German, replace Margaret, the daughter of George VI? Elizabeth came to the throne as a mother with 2 young children. It's been said that she will always do what is expected of her, always do her duty. The first duty of a king or queen is to produce an heir to carry on the line. Elizabeth got pregnant almost straight away after her marriage, and Prince Charles was born on the 14th of November 1948. A second child, Anne, had been born on the 15th of August 1950. The royal family is not like the rest of us, much as they try to give that appearance. In moments of risk and disaster, the royal family can look as if they have no understanding of how the rest of the world thinks. They can look bewildered. Elizabeth, for her entire life, thought it perfectly normal to be separated from her parents. From the very first, her mother and father might disappear for months at a time to the ends of the world. Elizabeth thought this completely normal, and when she became a mother, she had no hesitation in doing the same. The young Prince Charles was left behind for long periods. When Philip was posted to Malta, Elizabeth went with him, leaving Charles behind. Elizabeth enjoyed the life of a so-called ordinary naval wife, though it was never entirely ordinary. This, plus all the other royal trips and duties, meant that when she saw her children, they were almost strangers, and when they met, often brutally in front of cameras, it showed. The strange fact for ordinary people to realize is that Elizabeth does not think this way of bringing up children remarkable. The amateur psychologist can make endless analysis of what this can mean for both parent and child, but inevitably produces people who communicate their feelings poorly. Strict royal protocol always made Philip literally walk behind his wife. Political enemies settling scores had taken away his name and demoted him. Philip is not allowed to see the red boxes of secret state papers. He waits outside while the Queen sees her Prime Minister. Perhaps the most drastic way in which Elizabeth was to try and appease and make amends to her husband was to be in the upbringing of their children. Elizabeth has let Philip be the complete head of the family, an old-fashioned patriarch, taking all the decisions and ruling his children. Of course, in many ways, Philip is more ably qualified to be the normal parent than Elizabeth. Philip went to school. Elizabeth was educated by a private governess with little contact with normal, ordinary children. Philip had been through the rough and tumble of English public schools and the life of a midshipman, the most junior of young trainee officers in the Royal Navy. He had had to live alongside ordinary people, embarked on small warships. Philip had known what it is like not to be deferred to all his life. Those who are close to the royal family talk of Philip, for all his strictness and authoritarian toughness, as a man prepared to be a real father, who would actually make and spend time with the children. Elizabeth was the more distant, aloof, and separate parent who found motherhood difficult. It was announced that Prince Charles would go to school like any normal boy, the first member of the royal family not to have a private education. Those who would have the present believe Elizabeth enjoyed some happy time in the first part of her reign must stop and think about the story of the royal family and the press as Charles began school. Charles's first school was Hill House, an exclusive private school in London's Knightsbridge, just behind Harrods. Charles began his schooling quietly, with no formal announcement. When word of mouth rapidly spread that the heir to the throne was a pupil, the school became besieged by the media. Nothing appears new in Elizabeth's reign, the pattern of media intrusion and palace complaints. Pleas by Elizabeth for the cameras to back off would be a scene that would be replayed time and time again for Elizabeth's children and grandchildren, right up until the present day. Charles would be generally happy at that first school. When, a few years later, he was dispatched to a preparatory school at Cheam, the little boy began to encounter sadness. Charles was 2 months away from his 9th birthday when he was sent away from both his parents and his beloved nanny, the woman who had been there during his parents' absences. The first boarding school is a terrifying experience for any child. It was more so for Charles. Cheam was Philip's old school, chosen by him. His father had been good at games, the easy fast track to success and popularity. Charles was not. There were tougher, older boys who saw it their duty to make sure that the heir to the throne enjoyed no special treatment. Charles was observed terribly alone and very unhappy. In 1958, Charles was stunned while at school to hear his mother announce through the media that she had just created him Prince of Wales and Duke of Cornwall.
I intend to create my son Charles Prince of Wales today. When he is grown up, I will present him to you at Carnarvon.
She had not told her son this was going to happen. It was not a deliberate surprise. She had not forgotten. She thought he would just understand. It was done as a piece of royal public relations. There had been no Prince of Wales since the 1930s. It was an attempt to create excitement in the royal family. It actually made Charles even more of an odd boy out at school. Problems and controversy were gathering around Elizabeth's early reign. The Townsend affair was just the most prominent problem she faced. All around the throne, people were daring to say the previously unsayable. One of royalty's jobs is launching ships.
I name this ship Britannia. I wish success to her and to all who sail in her.
In 1953, Elizabeth was on this natural duty. No ordinary ship, this was Britannia, the new royal yacht. Britannia's story shows how, in just one more way, the respect and deference to the royal family thought correct was beginning to unravel. The royal family has a special connection to the British Navy. Elizabeth's father, husband, and grandfather had all been naval officers. There had been an old royal yacht, the Victoria and Albert. It had been declared obsolete in 1939, and many of the great journeys of Elizabeth's youth were by commercial liner, or as a passenger embarked on naval battleships. There was an official fudge that Britannia was in fact a hospital ship, a vital strategic reserve for wartime. In all the many wars that Britain would fight during Britannia's time, including the Falklands and the 1990 Gulf War, Britannia was never asked to take this role. Already, in 1953, the press began to ask awkward and difficult questions about the cost of the ship. Should taxpayers' money be spent on what seemed a giant pleasure boat? Should a Royal Navy, then pressed to find the ships, the men and the money to do its job, also have to run the yacht? The Townsend affair was soon to be joined as a crisis by a much larger, truly international event. This was the Suez Crisis of 1956, the invasion of Egypt by Britain, France, and Israel. A devious, secret conspiracy to mount an invasion aimed at destroying the Arab revolutionary government of Gamal Nasser. It had been a disaster. Before Suez, Britain believed it was still a great imperial power, able to do as it wished. The Suez invasion was not what America wanted, and despite the special relationship, insisted that Britain withdrew. America threatened to destroy the British currency. Britain was forced to obey America's wishes. It was a demotion from great power to second division status. The affair savagely divided Britain between those who believed it absolutely morally wrong to invade and those who were furious at the surrender to American demands. Suez has been famously described as the day the imperial music died. There was intense speculation as to what side Elizabeth was on. More importantly, Elizabeth became involved in controversy. Suez caused the fall of the British Prime Minister Anthony Eden. Appointing a Prime Minister is one of the few times a British sovereign actually has a real part in shaping events. The monarch sends for the person who can form a government and command the support of the Parliament. The ruling Conservative Party did not then elect its leaders, and the Queen had to consult its elder statesmen as to whom she should send for. There were two candidates, Rab Butler and Harold Macmillan. The people's choice as Prime Minister would have been Butler. Butler was by far the most popular choice in both the country and for modernisers in his own party. He stood for a new, modern, more middle-class, aspirational conservatism. Macmillan was linked to aristocracy, inherited wealth, to the grouse-shooting, country-loving, old ruling class. The truth remains hidden, but it appeared as if the old grandees of the Conservative Party advised Elizabeth against Butler to make sure that their man was in power. Elizabeth seemed to show her true colours as an aristocrat, closing ranks with the old, stuffy upper class that wanted no change, with old attitudes that led to both humiliation and shame at Suez. It would be a problem that would in time return. It is absolutely incredible to discover Elizabeth had never been overseas, never out of the United Kingdom until she was 20. It is a fact that separates Elizabeth from a younger generation. Elizabeth had not visited any part of the empire until she had gone with her parents and sister to South Africa in 1947. Elizabeth's father and grandfather, all her ancestors back to her great-great-grandmother Victoria, had not been mere kings or queens. They had been born to the title King Emperor or Queen Empress. The role of emperor was a persona, another part the British monarch was expected to play. Victoria and George V performed it to perfection as remote, almost godlike figures, as distant, unapproachable rulers. Mysterious figures, of which little was seen in person, but whose image, whose icon, in official pictures and statuary, was everywhere. After Suez, the idea of a Britain as a great empire dissolved before the eyes of Queen and country alike. Plans were quickly laid to unload the colonies as fast as possible, with a breakneck timetable for independence all over the empire. The empire was to become the Commonwealth, a union of independent nations linked by ties of shared history and culture. As part of this, Elizabeth was repackaged as a mother to the Commonwealth, a benevolent mother who would visit and help out her just grown up and just left home children.
This is the first time that I have spoken to New Zealanders in their own homeland, and my first words must be to tell you how happy I am to be amongst you. Standing at last on Australian soil, on this spot that is the birthplace of the nation, I want to tell you all how happy I am to be amongst you and how much I look forward to my journey through Australia. I am most grateful to you for the address which you have presented to me on behalf of the Maori people. My husband and I have been much inspired by the welcome we have been given here today.
Her new role was not remote, but visible and approachable. The idea was she was a queen who could be seen as much as possible through the media. The propaganda of this post-Suez royal family emphasized the moral example of this simple mother who was a queen. Elizabeth may have had everything, but she was happiest with her dogs and children and husband, it seemed. Even then, there were those who warned that to set up royalty as a role model for ideal behavior and moral life is a dangerous game, simply because, through position and wealth, royalty has so much temptation and opportunity to be immoral. The Suez invasion was one of Britain's wars which the royal yacht did not attend. Britannia could not take part in the campaign because she was on the far side of the world, carrying Philip on a tour of the Commonwealth. He was on his own, and it was a break from the palace, from everything. In the late 1950s, it had become apparent to many that there was a rift in the Queen's marriage. Elizabeth and Philip seemed to be leading separate lives. They had separate apartments at both Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle. Just as with Elizabeth's treatment of her children, it seems an area of life ordinary people cannot understand. To be married, yet keep separate rooms. Through choice, to separate for long periods, even at Christmas. Philip's trip on Britannia was just one of a number of long separations. It lasted from October 1956 through to the February of 1957. From nowhere in this trip reared yet another crisis for Elizabeth. With Philip, keeping him company was an old friend from Navy days, Mike Parker. Parker was Philip's equerry. After touring New Zealand, the Falkland Islands, Sri Lanka, the Gambia, even Antarctica, Britannia neared home and came alongside at Gibraltar. Parker's marriage was breaking up, and his wife threatened to call Philip as a witness to her husband's adultery. It was not simple adultery either, but adultery en masse at secret sex parties, at orgies. Parker was forced by the royal household to settle his divorce, told to resign from Philip's service, and was thrown off Britannia at Gibraltar. British papers skirted around the story, dropping hints. But American papers went for the jugular. They claimed Philip was having an affair, just one of a series, allegedly, with a girl he had met through his secret life he shared with Parker. And more, the royal couple were effectively separated. Britain's royal family had always ignored allegations of this kind. What was different was that the palace now chose to come out and deny it with angry denunciations. The British press reported the denials with relish. It seemed the royal family protested too much. The palace acted to squash the story of the rift. This was a busy time in British history. Harold Macmillan had only been Prime Minister for a few weeks. Macmillan proposed to Elizabeth that Philip be promoted to be a Prince of the United Kingdom. The present forgets that Philip had been born a Prince of Greece, but had had to give up that title when he took British nationality on his engagement to Elizabeth. Until 1957, he was simply the Duke of Edinburgh. Now, he was Prince Philip of the United Kingdom. It remains very secret what happened that February of 1957, but Elizabeth and Philip made a great show of being happily reunited when they finally met again, and he joined her from Gibraltar to make a joint visit to Portugal. Whatever the truth, both knew their duty. Elizabeth would soon reverse her earlier decision to reject the name Mountbatten. Elizabeth insisted that the name of the royal house stayed the House of Windsor, but that the more remote descendants, those who would branch away from the main trunk of the royal family tree and intermarry and merge with the upper classes, could use the double-barreled name Mountbatten Windsor. After this latest personal crisis, for the first time, serious elements of the media, as opposed to tabloid gossipers, began to question Elizabeth's value for money and her ability to be queen in the modern world. An aristocrat and journalist, Lord Altrincham, actually dared attack the Queen personally, saying Elizabeth spoke like a priggish schoolgirl. Altrincham found himself attacked in the street by a member of the incredibly named League of Empire Loyalists. Reputable commentators began to queue up to comment on Elizabeth. The journalist Malcolm Muggeridge attacked Elizabeth and the monarchy as sitting at the top of a rotten and useless class system that was obsolete and damaging to modern Britain. Muggeridge was banned from appearing on the BBC for his impudence, but it was the end of the old deference and self-censorship. Things would never be the same again for the monarch and the media. In the last years of the 1950s, Elizabeth's sister Margaret would become ever more a problem. What was the royal family to do with the beautiful, eligible, very desirable princess for whom they could not find a husband? The media, who had taken Margaret's side, now filled page after page with a guessing game of speculation. A man had only to stand in the same photograph as the princess in order to be married to her. In 1959, suddenly, Margaret told her sister of her intention to marry. The man she had chosen was Tony Armstrong-Jones. The news came from nowhere because the couple had simply been very good at keeping secrets. Insiders were worried that Margaret was on the rebound. She only accepted Tony's proposal when she heard the news that Peter Townsend was to marry a girl who was a Margaret lookalike and 20 years his junior. Friends told Tony not to do it. Tony was artistic and creative, energetic and easily bored, all the qualities that drew Margaret to him. He actually worked for a living as a photographer. In short, he was totally unlike the royal family. Elizabeth had doubts, but no will to oppose her sister again, and agreed to the marriage. But Elizabeth asked Margaret not to make her secret public until her own great event for the coming new decade had happened. In 1959, as perhaps the ultimate and final symbol and proof that all was well, that the royal family was a happy family, Elizabeth became pregnant with her third child. Duty and sacrifice are central forces shaping Elizabeth. As she awaited the coming new decade of the 1960s, it must have seemed that her devotion to duty and the sacrifice she had shown was both justified and rewarded. She was successfully doing her duty. She and her husband were together, and she was about to extend the royal family with a new baby. With her sister's coming marriage, Elizabeth's sacrifice of Margaret's happiness over Townsend seemed not to be in vain, and both the princess and the wider royal family seemed about to reap the rewards. Elizabeth was meant to be a new, modern queen. In truth, the woman behind the propaganda, even when she came to the throne, was behind her times. Elizabeth's bewilderment at the modern world is not a thing of her old age. History had begun to pick up pace as the 1950s passed by. The events of the 1950s challenged Elizabeth to change. She and the royal establishment had to run to catch up with the rest of the world. In the 1960s, the world would not slow down to wait.